Hello everyone, this is your instructor Arda Arikan speaking. I hope you are all doing fine. We will be talking about the Harlem Renaissance, which was a very important event or a chain of events in the history of American literature, which started in 1920s. We will basically talk about social, cultural, and economic reasons and appearances of this new phase in the history of American literature. Now, the Roaring Twenties were a period in history of dramatic social and political change. The time period following World War I was an important period in American history, as you know, as American economy grew much larger and national income and domestic production increased tremendously. Now in 1920s, for the first time in American literature, more Americans lived in cities than on farms. So more and more, America started to become an urban population. The nation's total wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929, and this economic growth swept many Americans into an affluent but unfamiliar consumer society. During this time, the United States experienced another change as more and more African Americans started to populate a district of New York called Harlem. When the 1920s began, the United States was composed of two distinct societies that appeared to be living together as though they were coexisting, but in fact, strict segregation laws separated whites from blacks. Blacks, as you can see on the photo on the left, blacks even shared different water fountains than blacks. Even if they were friends, they were not allowed to use the same toilets or restrooms, or at times they had to sit in different corners at cafes, even if they were allowed to be in those cafes or restaurants and so on. So although blacks and whites lived separately, the former worked for the other and lived under harsher conditions. During 1920s, New York's most powerful ethnic minority writers bravely claimed the city, at least, their neighborhood a microcosm. That is to say, African Americans started to live in Harlem, which became a home for the transient outcasts of American society. Like the Jewish immigrants crowded into the Lower East Side before them, Harlem's African American newcomers constituted a critical mass large. So prior to these African Americans, the area was populated by Jews. And as more and more African Americans started to moved especially from southern states to New York, they started to settle in those neighborhoods in Harlem that were previously populated by Jews, which added another flavor into this multi-ethnic composition of the region, an urban one. Populated by thousands, Harlem turned into a host for numerous subcultures, mainly composed of African Americans. By moving in Harlem, these subcultures not only achieves high visibility, but also shared and produced art, literature, and music that was energetic and mobile as much as these newcomers were. Mainly affected from the jazz age, during which jazz music is mainly produced by African Americans, became a norm in the world of music. The newcomers in Harlem were culturally and literally productive. Oftentimes, these African Americans met, sat together, ate and drank together, read together, and started to exchange information on music, arts, literature, and culture. Unlike their fathers and mothers who were slaves, these newcomers experienced relatively more independent lifestyles, although their lives continue to depend on the money provided by their white owners economically, although they were not slaves. And we will exemplify this in the later slides by focusing on literary production and publication companies' relationship. Now, although 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, was an age of economic wealth in the United States, Harlem was still poor, as most of its inhabitants were African Americans, constantly looking for jobs to pay their bills. As I've mentioned before, these newcomers in Harlem, the African Americans, continued working for their white bosses. However, Harlem also had its own cultural institutions, political organizations, clubs and cafes and theaters, newspapers and places of worship. So Harlem became a city within a city. The writers of the Harlem Renaissance were an extremely mobile crew who felt joined, not estranged, by their wanderings, because they were part of the great migration of Black people to the urban Northeast around World War I. So during this time in 1920s, many African American writers, composers, musicians, and artists like painters and so on, they started to travel back and forth between Paris and Harlem, New York. However, it was not only an international relationship. These African Americans were also mobile within the United States because they came from other places from the United States. Collectively, these African Americans developed a new vision of an urban home that was at once an organic place, a close community, and a cultural aspiration. When you look at this powerful, energetic age in Harlem, New York and its capital, Harlem, became the center of New York. So more and more whites started to use the cafes and bars and jazz clubs that were located in Harlem. Let's focus on this traveling in the Roaring Twenties that affected African Americans. Almost all Harlem Renaissance writers and musicians were what we would call urban wanderers. So they were from cities, but they traveled a lot. Even those who were raised in small towns came to Harlem from other cities. For instance, Du Bois was from the faculty of Atlanta University previously. Another, a Southerner, Zora Neale Hurston, worked as a manicurist in Washington, D.C. before coming to Harlem. Wallace Thurman was working at a post office in Los Angeles, California. And young and energetic and experimental Langston Hughes arrived from Cleveland, Nella Larsen from Chicago, Rudolph Fisher, again from Washington, D.C., Dorothy West from Boston, and James Weldon Johnson came from Jacksonville. And this list continues. These African Americans were from cities and on the move. And their energy brought more energy into Harlem. So these people were called the New Negroes. Unlike their fathers, who were slaves, as I've mentioned before, for the first time in American history in masses, that is to say, of course, there were some individual writers and musicians before them, but these new Negroes were fundamentally different from their predecessors. And they not only traveled within the United States, but they traveled almost all around the world. For instance, Claude McKay took off in 1922 for a 12-year vagabondage through major cities of Europe and Africa. Langston Hughes, one of the most important, prolific, and energetic writers of this period that was located in Harlem, Langston Hughes just kept coming back from sea or college for Harlem during weekends, vacations, and special occasions. And the leader of the Harlem Renaissance, County Cullen was raised in New York City, but spent many years in Paris, like so many Renaissance Harlemites who flocked to Paris by traveling back and forth between this monumental, historical, and at the same time culturally vibrant city of Europe and Harlem, which uh, passed on to the values and richnesses of African Americans into the newcomers. This multidimensionality of Harlem can be read from a post-colonial perspective too. So, of course, we can look at this period in Harlem from many different viewpoints. We can look at it from an economic perspective, cultural perspective, ethnic perspective, gender perspective, religious perspective, but also we can look at this period and geographical location from a post-colonial perspective. Now, the most post-colonial aspect of the Harlem Renaissance was its mixture of a strong Black identity that transcended white labels, West Indian, Negro, African, and so on. So again, for the first time in the history of the United States, many African Americans who lived in Harlem during their exchanges, intellectual exchanges especially, started to question their identities, their existence. Previously, they were named, they were labeled, they were called by the white population. But for the first time in history, they started to see and label themselves the way they wanted. For instance, in his work, Heritage, County Cullen asked this question, what is Africa to me? A link to others of African descent heritage, something that overflowed the colonial and national formations of the West. So, in a nutshell, as these populations in Harlem, African American populations in Harlem, started to bring their Africanness and African Americanness into this new urban space, they also started to learn from each other and learn from different ethnic minorities or religious minorities, sexual minorities, and so on. And they started to see themselves in a new light. So they started to label themselves the way they wanted. Now, was Harlem Renaissance heaven? Oh, sorry, was Harlem Renaissance a wonderful space or activity for all African Americans living in that period in that specific location? And in a shorter form, was Harlem heaven for African Americans or blacks? Well, yes and no. Yes, it provided a wonderful space for African Americans to live and exchange information, produce artwork, etc. Many artists, feeling the pressure of the opposed and hostile forces generated by the whites, fell into a despair about themselves and their situation. Many of them were still in poverty. When you look at historical records, you see that, for instance, a young Harlem schoolteacher, Aubrey Bowers, while writing to Carl Van Doren about Harlem as nigger heaven, complained that black writers in Harlem continued to submit themselves to the will of white publishers, by saying, how many magazines or publishers would accept Negro stories from a Negro viewpoint? They might accept a Negro's work if he would consent to denigrate his race and pander to the American idea that a Negro is either a down, a child, or a brute. But then he would not really be a Negro writer, he would only be a liar. Certainly, the Harlem Renaissance was American. For the first time, it was also a cultural movement of significant black autonomy, independence, if you may say, also. It realized the promise of diasporic consciousness that had always been implicit in black identity, because they moved from Africa to various geographical locations in the Americas, and then these people started to move into Harlem. That's why I'm saying diasporic population. And the dominant paradigms of national identity, African American identity, colonial centers, and literary traditions were redefined by these African Americans in this new urban space. That's why a reading of Harlem should incorporate using the space, not only the literary or artistic product, but also the space of Harlem as an energetic, vibrant space for people to co-create. And I would like to finish this session by reading Langston Hughes' poem titled Harlem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Don't forget to take notes and further your readings, and start to focus on some certain aspects of the Harlem Renaissance to understand its autonomous space in American literary history pertaining into the 1920s. Enjoy your time, remain healthy, keep safe. Bye-bye.